Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 6, Learning, and we're going to talk about reinforcement. So the power of reinforcement. Reinforcement or reinforcers are a condition involving either the presentation or removal of a stimulus that occurs after a response and strengthens that response. And B.F. Skinner preferred this objective term. Food, money, etc., they can serve this function as a reinforcer for most people. So do attention, praise, or a smile are all examples of what we call positive reinforcement, which strengthens a response by occurring after the response and making the behavior more likely to occur again. So, for example, if my daughter did something that was very positive and I gave her a smile right afterwards, chances are she's probably going to do that deed again. Positive reinforcement, this is a stimulus presented after a response, increasing the probability of that response happening again. It's kind of like math. Anything that's positive, you're kind of adding or applying something to. There's also negative reinforcement, that is the removal of an unpleasant or aversive stimulus. It's contingent on a particular behavior. And some people try to compare this with punishment using an umbrella to avoid getting wet during an downpour is an example of a behavior learned and maintained by negative reinforcement, by removing or subtracting something. But the thing to remember is that negative reinforcement is not a punishment, and you need to get that kind of through your mind, because typically you might be removing something aversive away, and that might actually not be such a bad thing. You're probably going to continue using an umbrella when it rains if you're going to continue to be dry. So ways to increase the behavior. Anytime that we talk about positive and negative reinforcement, chances are we're going to increase the behavior. So breaking it down again, positive is that you're adding a stimulus. Like in math, you're adding, and that could be like getting a hug or receiving a paycheck. Negative is the removal of something that you don't like. So if you don't like the sound of the beeping of your car when you don't have your safety belt clicked in, you will click in your safety belt to turn off that sound. So another example, positive reinforcement could be something like putting a coin in a vending machine and you get your cold soda back. And the whole idea is in the future, you're probably going to continue to use vending machines if you can get cold sodas. Negative reinforcement. So you didn't like being on this boring date and you say you have a headache. You remove the unpleasant stimulus, meaning that you end the boring date. And so you're probably more likely to use that tactic again on boring dates, saying that you got a headache. And so that way you can end the date. So reinforcing technology, the Skinner box. If you take a look down at the bottom left-hand corner, yes, that is B.F. Skinner's invention, the Skinner box. And he did use this supposedly on his own kids. Anyway, it's a simple device for studying the effect of reinforcers on lab animals. And a box with a lever, like you see at the bottom right-hand corner with this lab rat, basically the animal would press the lever and they would basically get some type of food pellet out of that. This becomes known as an operant chamber. And an operant chamber is a box-like apparatus that can be programmed to deliver reinforcers, but it also could deliver punishments in conjunction with the animal's behavior. And if you notice down at the bottom of this cage is an electric grid, and so the animal could get a shock if they're doing something inappropriately. There is not an electric grid in the Skinner box for the little baby over here on the other side. Some people thought that that's what was going on, but that's not what's really going on. That would definitely be abusive. Anyway, the operant chamber is often called the Skinner box. And the importance of the operant chamber was that it could be set up to control the timing and the frequency of that reinforcer. If you take a look at the baby tender or the Skinner box that has the baby in it, um, Skinner devised this for his daughter, Deborah, and it consisted of an enclosure. It was temperature controlled, which unfortunately bore a superficial resemblance to the operant chamber that he used in his experiments, and hence a lot of people kind of associated the two together. Not really the same thing. All right, contingencies of reinforcement. College and university students are reinforced for studying with report cards or midterms 2 or maybe 3 times a year if they go to summer school. In any operant learning situation, the timing and the frequency of the rewards is really crucial. So, reinforcement contingencies, this is the relationship between a response and the changes in the situation or the stimulation that follow the response. So, they deal with many different ways of associating responses and reinforcers. So, as we go along, we're going to talk about positive, again, reinforcement, negative reinforcement. But we're also going to get into talking about negative punishment or omission training and positive punishment as a way to kind of talk about how we're going to reinforce. So continuous versus intermediate or reinforcement. And continuous reinforcement, this is a type of reinforcement schedule by which all correct responses are reinforced. So it's a useful tactic early on in the learning process. It gives feedback on how well each response is performed and is useful for shaping complex new behaviors. Potty training is a great example of when you might be using continuous reinforcement. If you're trying to get a young child to use a potty chair, you might reward them with maybe a sticker or a piece of candy each time that they go to that potty chair and perform the task as a way to kind of get them to shape that new behavior. Shaping is an operant learning technique in which a new behavior is produced by reinforcing responses that are similar to the desirable response. So teachers, for the most part, use shaping and can continually raise, there we go, the bar or increase the standard required for earning a reward by telling the learner when the performance has been improved. So you might have heard of things like L to J, which is something that is used for teaching vocabulary. And by rewarding students for learning these new vocab words and then eventually changing how you go back and reward at a later date, that can be involved in the shaping process. Drawbacks of continuous reinforcement, when you accidentally fail to reward the correct response on a trial, it could easily be misinterpreted as a signal that the response was not correct, confusing the subject. Continuous reinforcement typically loses its reinforcing qualities as the organism becomes satisfied. So at some point in time, you're going to have to change this up, is really what it's coming down to. So that leads us to the intermittent reinforcement. This is a type of reinforcement schedule in which some, but not all, the correct responses are reinforced. Sometimes this is called partial reinforcement. Rewards for some, but not all, the responses is basically what this is coming down to. A less frequent schedule of rewards, perhaps after every third correct response, can serve as an incentive. An advantage is that it is often resistant to extinction. So let's talk about potty training again. If you were rewarding every response, even if the child didn't use the potty chair, intermittent might be used when they actually do use it, and then to reinforce that every third time that they do that with some type of sticker or treat might be one way to get them to continually use that. All right. Extinction We talked about extinction when we talked about classical conditioning. In operant conditioning, extinction is the process by which a response has been learned, is weakened by the absence or the removal of the reinforcement. So this occurs when reinforcement is withheld. So gambling is an example of this. If the slot machine had been paying off stops, one notices the difference compared to a gambler whose slot machine never paid off and may keep playing and playing and playing. The rewarded gambler forgets for a longer period of time, or plays for a longer period of time. There we go. Schedules of reinforcement. These are programs specifying the frequency and the timing of the reinforcement based on the number of responses. You can talk about the ration or ratio. It should be ratio schedules. This is a program by which the reinforcement depends on the number of correct responses. And so you could talk about fixed ratio schedules, or FRs, if you want to call it that. These are programs by which the reinforcement is contingent on a certain unvarying number of responses, such as your paycheck, or if you do piecework, meaning that you complete so many items and then you get rewarded for that. The variable ratio schedule, or the VR, is a reinforcement program by which the number of responses required for reinforcement varies from time to time. So telemarketing is a wonderful example of this, because you're not always going to be reinforced after every phone call. All right, interval schedules. This is a program by which the reinforcement depends on the time interval elapsed between the last reinforcement. Time is of the essence. Reinforcement is based on responses made within a certain time period instead of a number of responses given. And so fixed intervals, or your FI, are common in the work world, where they may appear as a monthly paycheck program by which the reinforcement is contingent on a certain fixed period of time. The time period between the rewards remains constant. Okay, when we look at the variable interval, these are programs by which the time period between the reinforcement varies from trial to trial. It's unpredictable. And a great example of that is going fishing. You can cast in, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to get a bite every time you cast. Even if you do get a nibble, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to reel the fish in. So it's highly unpredictable, but it keeps people participating. So breaking this down a little bit, your fixed ratio schedule, response rate is high, patterns of response, steady response with low ratio, meaning a brief pause after each reinforcement with a high ratio. Higher the ratio, the more resistance to extinction. When we talk about variable, there's the highest response rate, constant response pattern, no pauses, most resistant to extinction. Fixed interval, lowest response rate, long pause after the reinforcement followed by a gradual acceleration. The longer the interval, the more resistant to extinction. And then the variable interval, this is a moderate response rate. It's stable, uniform response, more resistant to extinction than the fixed interval, and with the same average intervals. So, if you were breaking this down into a graphic as far as like by time and the number of responses, you have your fixed and variable ratio. You have to do those very quickly. The number of responses are pretty good. If you break it down into the intervals, might take a little bit more responses, but the time factor, you can play on that just a little bit longer. So breaking it down again with the reinforcement schedules, continuous, that's like after every response, praise for the most part, fixed interval response after a specific time period, weekly, bi-monthly, monthly paychecks, variable interval response after varying periods. So transfers, unexpected bonuses, promotions, recognition. Sometimes that's good to kind of keep people's incentives high. Fixed ratio, this is the fixed number of responses. Most or must occur before the reinforcement. So your piece rate or commission units, you have to complete the task before you get the money. And then variable ratio, this is the varying number or average of responses that must occur before the reinforcement. So random checks for quality at work. So if you get, somebody coming in to review your job or appraise after, so often, that might be part of that. So primary and secondary reinforcers. So primary reinforcers, this could be anything from food, sex, anything that has an innate basis because of their biological value to an organism. Whereas more often we're going to see things that are on the line of the secondary or the conditioned reinforcers. This is stimuli such as money or tokens that acquire their reinforcing power by a learned association with the primary reinforcers or the neutral stimuli. Any stimuli can become a secondary reinforcer. Token economies, these are therapeutic methods based on operant conditioning by which individuals are rewarded with tokens, which act as secondary reinforcers to get people to kind of, do things. The tokens can be redeemed for a variety of rewards and privileges. So if you were talking about like a prison system, typically they do use token economies. If a person is performing very good behaviors, then they might get some type of token that they can go back and reimburse for maybe a magazine or a book or something that they want. Token economies work really well in elementary classrooms, and that could be like so many gold stars, or it could be so many pink slips or so many yellow slips saying that they have done good deeds. Preferred activities as reinforcers. This is something known as the Premack principle. This actually works very well, and the opportunity to perform a desirable activity can be a reinforcer, can reinforce your behavior just as effectively as food or drink or other primary reinforcers. And the Premack principle at work here says that a preferred activity can be used to reinforce a less preferred one, hence the Premack principle. The concept that a more preferred activity can be used to reinforce one that's less preferred. And it's named after David Premack from 1965, who first demonstrated this on thirsty rats, which increases their running in an exercise wheel when they learned that the running would be followed by an opportunity to have a drink. Not to say that that works well with track, and after you run so long, you can go get a drink, but it could be like this. I want you to study, okay? But I know there's a low probability there, and I pair that up with something that you want to do. Chances are that probably has something to do with your phone. And so if you study for so long, you get to have use of your phone for so many minutes and such. We can use Premack principles on ourselves, and it actually works very, very well. All right, we're going to talk about punishment next.